Let's get some of the details of U.S. imperialism. First, let's talk about the Canal Zone. Teddy Roosevelt had traveled to Europe, and when he takes office, he knew a lot more about foreign affairs than most of his predecessors. And one foreign affair that he knew needed to be dealt with was the creation of a canal through the Central America Isthmus. Now, during the Spanish-American War, the battleship Oregon had been forced to steam all the way around the tip of South Africa to join the fleet in Cuba. It was actually coming from the Pacific and going to Cuba. I think I misspoke in class. Now, such a canal would make defense of some of the recent acquisitions, like the Philippines, as well as Hawaii and Guam, and then Puerto Rico in the Caribbean, a lot easier too. However, we signed a treaty with Great Britain in 1850, known as the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty, which said that neither Britain nor America would build a Central American canal without the other's help and consent. They didn't want one of them to have control of it and the other one not have it. However, in 1901, the Hay-Pauncefote Treaty, I know I said that wrong, was signed in 1901, which nullified that. It said either country could build a canal whenever they wanted. The United States first considers a route through Nicaragua, but the old French Canal Company really wanted to make some money off of their initial efforts, which were proving unsuccessful so far. They wanted to be able to sell what they had done and at least recoup some of the costs from their failure in the Panama region of Colombia. Now, the director of that French Canal Company, who wants so badly for America to not build their canal in Nicaragua, but rather buy the old French one that they were working on in Panama, his name was Philippe Buenaventura. Now, the United States finally did choose to build their canal in part of Colombia known as Panama. So the United States started negotiating a treaty with Colombia that would buy it for about $10 million and give them $250,000 annually to use it. But this treaty was rejected by the Colombian government. And they owned Panama, so it was their say. Now, Teddy Roosevelt is upset since he really wanted construction of the canal to begin before his presidential campaign in 1904. On November 3rd, 1903, there's a revolution in Panama. When Colombia tries to put down the revolution, the U.S. Navy blocked the Colombian military from intervening. Panama was then recognized by the United States as an independent nation, and 15 days later, Buenaventura, who had been elected to the Panamanian government, even though he was French, signed the Hay-Buenaventura Treaty that gave the United States the land to build the Panama Canal. Now, Roosevelt didn't plan to rip Panama away from Colombia, but to some people, and especially people in Latin America, it seems like that. And his actions in this event really kind of give him a black eye. They're a X in the bad column for Teddy Roosevelt. Shortly thereafter, U.S. Marines landed in Cuba in 1906 to maintain order in Cuba. And this seems like more of the same. In fact, Latin American countries refer to this as the bad neighbor policy of the United States, where the United States keeps intervening in Latin American countries when maybe they weren't wanted. Let's turn to the other side of the world now. China, following its loss in a war with Japan in 1894, China starts to get carved up, like we can see in this map, into separate spheres of influence by European powers. Britain takes this little area over here and says we're in charge. Japan says we're in charge of this part of China. France says we're in charge of this part of China. This concerns America because you don't see America on that map. We wanted to be able to continue to trade with all parts of China. We wanted our missionaries to be able to continue to work spreading Christianity in all parts of China. Secretary of State John Hay decides to do something about it, and eventually, in 1899, he issues what's called the Open Door Note, which proclaims what's called the Open Door Policy. This is the policy that says that to keep fair competition, all nations in China will not exert undue control over one area. In other words, China will be open to everyone. Now, this really makes everybody who was already in China a little bit nervous. Italy is the only one who agrees to the open door policy unconditionally. And that's because, like us, Italy didn't have anything in China at the time. Russia didn't accept it at all. Most of the other European powers did, though, on certain conditions. And as a result, China remains fairly open to U.S. influence. In 1900, a super patriotic group in China known as the Boxers revolted and took over the capital of China, Beijing, and they took all foreigners hostage, including diplomats. So a multinational force, and that's what we see here, was sent in to put down the rebellion. And those foreign powers made China pay over $300 million in damages. The U.S. got some of that money. And worried that European powers would carve China up for good, John Hay officially asks that China not be divided up. However, due to the conflict we talked about in class between Russia and Japan, the United States lost its two allies in Russia and Japan, and neither of them felt they had received their fair share of the winnings. After the Spanish-American War, many Japanese immigrants started coming into California, and it really raises some fears among locally born people in California. In 1906, after the San Francisco earthquake, the city said in San Francisco that due to a lack of space, Japanese children should attend a special school. And as you can imagine, this instantly became an international issue. Roosevelt eventually settles it, and San Francisco said they would not displace students, while Japan agreed to keep its workers in Japan. This is known as the Gentleman's Agreement. Now, to impress Japan, Roosevelt sent his entire battleship fleet around the world for a tour, and this is sometimes called the Great White Fleet. And it received tremendous salutes in Latin America and New Zealand and Hawaii and Australia and Japan. And this really kind of helps relieve some of the tensions we had built with other nations. Also, the Root Takahira Agreement said that the United States and Japan would respect each other's territorial possessions in the Pacific and uphold to the open note on China, the open door policy in China. Let's talk briefly about Roosevelt. In 1904, construction began on the Panama Canal. There's initially problems with landslide and sanitation and disease. Eventually, the workers get organized after they find how to best deal with the yellow fever that had been plaguing some of the workers. When Roosevelt goes and visits the Panama Canal in 1906, he's the first U.S. president to leave America and to go to foreign soil. And the canal was finally finished and opened in 1914, and it ended up costing about $400 million. Latin American nations like Venezuela and Dominican Republic were having a hard time paying for their debts to European debtors. So Britain and Germany decided to send a bit of force to South America to make them pay. Roosevelt is worried that if European powers interfere in Central and South America to collect debts, then they might just stay in Latin America, which would be a blatant violation of the Monroe Doctrine. This is why he issues the Roosevelt Corollary, which states that in future cases of debt problems, the U.S. would take over and pay off the debts. This would eliminate any excuse for Europeans to go into Latin American countries. In other words, no one could bully Latin America except the United States. In 1904, Japan attacked Russia, and since Russia had been in Manchuria and proceeded to administer a series of humiliating victories until the Japanese began to run short on men. Now, for this and his mediation of North African disputes in 1906 through an international conference, Roosevelt received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1906. So helping Japan and Russia settle their disagreement along with his work in North Africa, Teddy Roosevelt receives the Nobel Peace Prize in 1906.